This is very much like the old song, The Woman Who Swallowed a Fly. At the end of it, it didn't go well for her.
Before Brexit, it was obvious that farmers were going to be turned into environmentalists because the intention was always to import more food and stand farming down. Patrick Minford made that clear in 2012 in the Liaison Committee. But now here we have Edwin Poots moaning about what's going on with farming and the lack of support because of Brexit. And, of course, the best people to blame are the civil servants.
The former Agriculture Minister for Northern Ireland, Edwin Poots. Edwin, how bad is it on farms at the moment?
It's been an unusually wet spring, so there are costs for straw, for bedding the animals here. Our cost for silage, for feeding the animals, has doubled over the course of the last few months. And what farmers actually need is support in these crisis times as opposed to some universal benefit.
Was it the case that in those negotiations after Brexit that civil servants didn't seem to realise how farming worked and maybe a more environmental lobby was in place?
Yeah, but the environmental lobby was an illogical lobby, what they were pressing for. And the British public have been sold short. So we've been buying gas from Russia, we've been buying oil from the Middle East, and we're buying food from all over the world. Whenever we have our own gas and oil in the North Sea, and whenever we should be producing our own food in Britain, it is entirely illogical for the government not to provide security both in energy and food.
But you were in those negotiations. You had to deal with trying to get the best for farmers here in Northern Ireland.
If you look at the landmass of the United Kingdom, there are so many opportunities to ensure that you can look after the environment on the one hand, but also feed the nation on the other. And that's what we should be doing, as opposed to importing food from other countries, which produces that food at a higher carbon level than farmers in Britain do.
Well, there you go. That came from a man that was in those negotiations, and we can tell you that this is very much like the old song, The Woman Who Swallowed a Fly. At the end of it, it didn't go well for her.
Well, let's debate it now with James Fairley, who's a potato farmer, and Dennis McShane, former Labour Minister of State for Europe, who's here in the studio. Good to see you both this morning. Dennis, explain this to us in a way that is going to make... Well, if you're a farmer, if you're involved in the business, this is all very relevant. For the rest of us, we don't quite understand what's going on.
Oh, I think we do. I mean, the coverage of farming, I've been doing European politics for decades, and it's a #1 issue in Europe. I agree in Britain it isn't, and it would have been much more helpful if Mr Poots, as former First Minister of Northern Ireland, had actually told the truth to Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage that leaving the European Union would be devastating for farmers and for fishermen, fisherwomen. I've got lots of stats, and I'm sure Mr Fairley has as well, that it's just devastated export markets. We've lost all the subsidies. And believe me, the gentlemen in Whitehall don't give a monkey's about farmers. Europeans did. So perhaps we could just have our farming industry back in the EU and all will be better.
McShane is absolutely right. British farming was better off in the European Union, mainly because the strength of the farming lobby in Europe is much stronger. The communities are much more connected to farming than British people are.
James, let's bring you in on this one. I mean, how bad is it on farms at the moment? Because if you look across Europe as well, it must be tough there, because we've seen the farmers protest in Holland and in France too.
Well, exactly. You know, it's not all a bed of roses in Europe. It's actually worse, because you see them protesting a lot harder than we are.
There's no doubt that European farmers are much better off than British farmers. Yes, they are protesting at the moment, but then European farmers protest every year. It's really nothing unusual. The only thing that's unusual is the British press are covering the European farming protests.
I mean, Dennis, I have to go back to you talking about we don't get any subsidies. Well, we're still getting our full subsidy. Our export markets are still open. The seed industry has been very tight this year for potatoes in Scotland because the seed's just not there, and we're doing a lot of exporting. So in terms of receiving subsidy, why should an industry like ours have to survive on the back of getting a subsidy? Can we not just survive and actually getting paid a fair price for what we do?
So as you just heard, Brexit delivered a totally unfair, unlevel playing field in Britain, in the UK, with Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland still getting food subsidies at the moment, and the English farmers have had their subsidy removed. James says that we're still exporting. Well, yes, of course we're still exporting, but it's harder to export and it's more costly to export. When items are short in supply, they're still going to be in demand, but you're not going to make as much money out of it because of the trade barriers. It's costly. Added to which, every country in the world subsidises food, whether it's direct payments or indirectly. This is what governments do to ensure that they have food security.
Oh, Dennis, I mean, that's a great point.
It's a great point. I mean, I'd love to have a fair price for appearing on GB News, but I have to accept what they're prepared to pay me.
You get one.
Jim. Probably it's an over-generous one. It's a boring thing called the market. We all like it. We don't want to spend more on cars to pay for car workers, as it were. But in general, in Europe, I mean, I know I follow all these problems in Europe. And the French farmers, I lived in France for 15 years, believe me, Jim, if I may, they do that every winter. There's a regular winter ritual of the tractors dumping the dung in front of the local politicians' offices. But that said, the number of people on farms has declined dramatically. The investment isn't going into farming. But I was in France, sort of a seaside resort, a bit like Brighton, if you like, over the Easter weekend with grandchildren. And all their supermarkets put local produce at the front of the stall. They really promote French food. Does Asda do that? Does Tesco do that? Does Sainsbury's, Marks and Spencer's just across the road from here in GB News? No. And we should do far more to support our farmers in Britain like they do in the continent. But you won't find a Tory minister who's interested in looking again at this. This is the worst failure of Brexit. There are many other failures, but this is the worst one. And you're right to say it's cost us great damage, and I don't know if anybody's got the guts to try and put it right.
James, we are almost out of time, so just last word to you.
Yeah, just on that, what you're saying there, Dennis, doesn't really back up being in the EU, because actually what we're doing is we're making it harder for imports to come in from the EU. So we are supporting British farmers. We have more British produce on the shelves now. What we have to stop is the imports from Australia and New Zealand of cheaper lamb and beef. Ooh. That's a bigger issue. They're not even part of the EU.
So here we have it, the protectorate Brexit supporter who wants to stop all imports, which is totally unrealistic because we can't ever be self-sufficient in food. Brexit made it harder for us to export our foods to our biggest export market. 90% of our agriculture exports go to Europe. And what it did then was open up these trade deals, which has given huge access to Australia and New Zealand and South America, certainly through CPTPP, other countries, huge producers, to dump their foods here in Britain, which is going to be a heck of a lot worse than any of the European imports which we have enjoyed.
I mean, we don't want to get run by people in Brussels telling us how to farm our land here. That just doesn't work by self-elected people.
It's the UK which has unelected ministers, including the Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, David Frost, the Brexit Secretary, and Zach Goldsmith. British farming is definitely the sacrificial lamb of Brexit, and British farming is definitely better off in the European Union.
Poor Aussies. Oh, poor New Zealanders.
Well, we're out of time. It's good to talk to you both this morning. Thanks very much indeed.
There's a lot of talk about farmers and Brexit. But as you can see from this interview, the farmers that did support Brexit did so thinking that it would improve British farming, because in the last 2 years, British farming has been going through a difficult time, and that is mainly to do with the fact that successive governments have handed too much power to supermarkets to drive down farm gate prices. And they thought Brexit would make things better, but actually it's made everything a heck of a lot worse.